Picture this. It's May 20th, 1521. A Spanish soldier named Íñigo López de Loyola is standing on the walls of Pamplona, facing down a massive French army. His fellow defenders want to surrender. They're massively outnumbered. The situation is hopeless. But Íñigo, he's not having it. This guy is so full of pride, so obsessed with glory and honor, that he'd rather die than give up. And in a way, that's exactly what happened. A French cannonball smashed into his legs, shattering bones and ending his military career forever. But here's the thing that'll blow your mind. That single cannonball blast didn't just destroy one man's dreams. It set in motion a chain of events that would reshape Christianity, send missionaries to literally every corner of the earth, educate millions of people, spark some of the biggest controversies in church history, create the first global education system, survive complete suppression by the Pope himself, influence modern science and linguistics, and eventually put the first Jesuit Pope on the throne of St. Peter. What if I told you that this injured soldier would create what some people call Jesus' Army, a group? So dedicated to following Christ's example that they'd become both the most loved and most feared organization in Christian history? We're talking about an order that would baptize hundreds of thousands in Asia, protect indigenous peoples in the Americas, build universities that still educate world leaders today, get completely banned by the Catholic Church, then come back from the dead stronger than ever. This is the story of the Jesuits, officially known as the Society of Jesus. And trust me, it involves more drama, intrigue, sacrifice, and world-changing impact than any Netflix series you've ever binged. We're going to explore conspiracy theories that have some basis in reality, miraculous stories that shaped history, scientific discoveries that advanced human knowledge, and political controversies that toppled governments. But most importantly, we're going to ask the question that drives everything. What happens when people take Jesus' teachings to their absolute extreme? So buckle up, because we're about to journey from 16th century Spanish castles to the imperial courts of China, from the jungles of Paraguay to the laboratories of Europe, from the halls of the Vatican to modern refugee camps. And we're going to discover that the story of trying to follow Jesus radically is never simple, never safe, and never boring. Now, to really understand what makes this story so incredible, we need to get inside the head of our main character before everything changed. Íñigo López de Loyola wasn't some pious kid destined for religious life. This dude was the complete opposite of what you'd expect from someone who'd eventually become a saint. Born around 1491 in the Basque region of northern Spain, Íñigo was living what we might call his best life. Picture a medieval version of a trust fund kid with anger management issues and a gambling problem. His family had money, influence, and a castle. Literally, a castle. But they also had a reputation for violence and lawlessness that was so bad, the Spanish crown actually ordered parts of their castle demolished as punishment. His grandfather was exiled for criminal behavior, his father had children with multiple women, and the family was constantly involved in feuds with their neighbors. It was like Game of Thrones, but with more Catholic guilt and fewer dragons. When Íñigo hit his teenage years, he got sent to court to learn the refined arts of being a nobleman. And by refined arts, I mean he learned to fight, gamble, chase women, and dress like he was starring in a Renaissance fashion magazine. The guy was obsessed with his appearance. Tight-fitting boots, fancy clothes, perfectly styled hair. He was that guy who spent more time getting ready than his girlfriend did. And the gambling? Don't get me started. Íñigo was so addicted to gambling that he regularly got into sword fights over card games, not arguments, actual sword fights where people could die. But here's what's fascinating about this period. Íñigo was completely consumed with earthly glory. He dreamed constantly about heroic deeds that would win him fame, fortune, and the love of some unnamed noblewoman he was obsessed with. His biographers tell us he spent hours daydreaming about knights and chivalry, about grand gestures that would make him legendary. In modern terms, he was basically fantasizing about going viral. Except instead of social media fame, he wanted battlefield glory and royal recognition. This obsession with worldly success is crucial because it shows us just how far God was about to take this guy. We're not talking about a gradual spiritual awakening here. This is going to be a complete 180-degree transformation that happens during months of forced bed rest. And that transformation is going to become the template for how Jesuits approach conversion. They're going to become masters at helping people examine their deepest desires and figure out what's actually going to satisfy their souls. So there's Inigo in 1521, 30 years old and still chasing worldly glory, when he ends up defending Pamplona against the French. And this is where his pride becomes both his downfall and, paradoxically, his salvation. Any rational military leader would have looked at the situation and negotiated a surrender. The French massively outnumbered the Spanish defenders. They had superior firepower, and holding the fortress was basically a suicide mission. But Inigo convinced his fellow soldiers to fight on. Why? Because surrendering would have been dishonorable, and honor mattered more to him than life itself. The battle was brief and brutal. The French overwhelmed the defenders, and during the assault, a cannonball struck near where Inigo was standing. The iron ball ricocheted off a wall and smashed into both his legs, completely shattering the right one and badly damaging the left. In an instant, everything this man had built his identity around was gone. No more military career, no more dreams of battlefield glory, no more perfectly fitted boots and courtly dancing. But here's where the story gets interesting in a way that speaks directly to how God works in our lives. The French, who had every reason to just leave him there to die, were so impressed by his courage that they carried him back to his family's castle. Think about that for a second. His enemies became his rescuers because his dedication to his principles, even misguided ones, earned their respect. The journey home was agony. Remember, we're talking about 1521. No painkillers, no shock treatment, just a shattered man being carried over rough roads for days while his broken bones ground against each other with every bump. When he finally made it home, the doctors delivered more bad news. The leg had been set wrong during the battle. If he wanted any chance of walking again, they'd have to re-break it and set it properly, without anesthesia. So they re-broke his leg. And when it healed, there was still a protruding bone that would have shown through those tight courtly pants he loved so much. So what did Inigo do? He insisted they break it again and cut off the offending piece of bone. Then he chained weights to his leg and spent hours every day stretching it, trying to restore its original length. All without any pain medication stronger than whatever medieval herbs they could find. The man was basically torturing himself because he couldn't stand the idea of looking imperfect in fashionable clothes. This gives you a sense of the kind of person we're dealing with. Inigo had an all-or-nothing personality that bordered on obsessive. When he wanted something, he pursued it with an intensity that most people would consider unhealthy. He was willing to endure incredible pain rather than compromise his ideals, even when those ideals were shallow. And this is exactly the personality type that God was about to redirect toward himself. During those long months of recovery, as Inigo lay in bed dealing with constant pain and boredom, he asked for some romance novels to pass the time. You know, those medieval stories about knights rescuing damsels and performing heroic deeds. But the castle didn't have any. Instead, someone brought him 2 books, The Life of Christ, by Ludolf of Saxony, and The Lives of the Saints. Imagine his disappointment. Here he is, stuck in bed for months, and instead of entertaining adventure stories, he gets religious biography. But this is where the Holy Spirit started to work in ways that Inigo couldn't have anticipated. As he read these books, something strange began to happen. He found himself getting caught up in the stories of Christ and the saints. He started daydreaming about performing great deeds for God instead of for earthly glory. He began fantasizing about outdoing St. Francis and St. Dominic in holiness and service. And here's the crucial part. He started paying attention to how these different daydreams affected him emotionally. When he daydreamed about returning to his old life of military glory and romantic conquest, he felt excited in the moment, but afterward he was left feeling empty and dissatisfied. But when he dreamed about following Christ and becoming a great saint, he felt a deep, lasting peace and joy that stayed with him long after the daydream ended. This process of paying attention to the movements of his heart, of learning to distinguish between desires that ultimately satisfy and those that ultimately leave us empty, would become central to Jesuit spirituality. What Inigo was discovering, lying there in his castle bed, was exactly what Jesus meant when he said, "Whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it." His entire previous life had been about preserving and promoting himself, but as he contemplated a life given over entirely to Christ, he experienced a kind of contentment and purpose he'd never felt before. By the time his leg was healed enough for him to walk again, with a permanent limp that would remind him daily of this transformation, Inigo had made a decision that would change everything. He was going to dedicate his life completely to following Jesus, not just going to Mass on Sundays or saying prayers before meals. He was going to pursue holiness with the same obsessive intensity he'd once devoted to military glory. But Inigo didn't just decide to follow Jesus. He developed something that would become one of the most revolutionary innovations in Christian history. And before we go any further in our story, we need to understand what made it so groundbreaking. Because this wasn't just another prayer book or devotional guide. Now let me tell you about something that most people don't realize was one of the most revolutionary innovations in Christian history. The spiritual exercises might sound like just another religious book to us, but in the 16th century, this was absolutely radical. Think about it. Most people's relationship with God was mediated through the institutional church. You went to Mass, you listened to sermons, you followed the religious calendar, but the idea that an ordinary person could have intimate, ongoing conversations with Jesus, that was revolutionary territory. What Inigo developed was essentially a 4-week intensive retreat program designed to walk someone through a complete spiritual transformation. And when I say intensive, I mean intensive. We're talking about 4 to 5 hours of prayer and meditation every single day, with the entire experience carefully structured to move you through different stages of spiritual development. Here's where it gets really innovative. Instead of just thinking about spiritual concepts in abstract terms, Inigo taught people to use their imagination to place themselves directly into biblical scenes. Picture this. You're not just reading about Jesus' crucifixion. You're imagining yourself standing at the foot of the cross, watching it happen, seeing the blood, hearing the sounds, feeling the emotions of the people around you. You're not just learning about Jesus calling his disciples. You're imagining him walking up to you personally and asking you to follow him. What would you say? How would you respond? This imaginative approach to prayer was absolutely groundbreaking. Modern neuroscience has confirmed what Inigo figured out intuitively. When you vividly imagine an experience, your brain processes it almost like a real experience. The emotions you feel, the insights you gain, the decisions you make during these imaginative prayers can be just as transformative as actual encounters. The exercises start with what he called the first week, where you spend time really confronting the reality of sin and your need for God's mercy. Not in a guilt-tripping way, but in an honest, liberating way that helps you see how much God loves you despite your brokenness. The second week focuses on the life of Christ, but you're walking alongside Jesus, watching him interact with people, listening to his teachings, observing how he handles conflict and pressure and temptation. Throughout this process, you're constantly asking yourself, what is Jesus calling me to specifically? Not just what does he want from Christians in general, but what does he want from me, personally, uniquely? What's my particular way of following him? The third week concentrates on Jesus' passion and death. But again, you're there with him, suffering with him, learning what it means to love sacrificially. And the fourth week focuses on the resurrection and the joy of new life in Christ. By the end of these 4 weeks, Most people who completed the full exercises had experienced such a profound encounter with Jesus that their lives were permanently changed. But here's what made this even more revolutionary. Inigo didn't design this just for monks or priests or specially holy people. He designed it for anyone who was serious about following Christ. Merchants, students, soldiers, nobles, commoners, anyone could make these exercises and discover their personal calling from God. This democratization of deep spiritual experience was going to become central to everything the Jesuits did. The exercises don't just help people become better Christians in a general sense. They help people become radically committed Christians who are willing to do whatever Jesus asks of them, no matter how difficult or unconventional it might be. When you've spent a month in intensive prayer, imagining yourself in conversation with Christ, asking Him directly what He wants from your life, and receiving what feels like a personal answer, that creates a level of commitment that can move mountains. And this brings us to how Inigo and his first companions understood Jesus' calling on their lives, and how they developed the most systematic approach to following Christ that the world had ever seen. Once Inigo had his life-changing encounter with Christ, he faced the question that every serious Christian eventually has to answer. Okay, now what? Jesus had called his disciples with a pretty clear mission statement. Go into all the world and make disciples of all nations. But how exactly were he and his friends supposed to do that in the 16th century? When Inigo was studying in Paris in his 30s, because remember, his conversion meant starting completely over, including learning Latin and getting a proper education, he began gathering a group of like-minded friends around him. And the way he recruited them tells us everything about the Jesuit approach to discipleship. He didn't try to convince them with arguments or theological debates. Instead, he invited them to make the spiritual exercises themselves, to have their own personal encounters with Christ, and to discern their own calling directly from God. One by one, these brilliant young men, Francis Xavier, who would become one of the greatest missionaries in Christian history, Peter Faber, and several others destined for successful careers, went through the exercises and came out completely transformed. They decided that whatever God was calling them to do, they wanted to do it together as companions in Christ's service. On August 15, 1534, 7 of them climbed up to a chapel on Montmartre in Paris and made vows that would change the world. They vowed poverty, chastity, and a pilgrimage to Jerusalem to walk where Jesus walked. But they also made a backup plan that was even more radical. If they couldn't get to Jerusalem within a year of finishing their studies, they would go to Rome and offer themselves to the Pope to be sent wherever he thought they could do the most good for souls. Think about what they were signing up for. They were basically saying, God, we're yours. Send us anywhere. Ask us to do anything, and we'll say yes. This wasn't just joining a religious order with predictable routines and comfortable monasteries. This was enlisting in what they literally called the Company of Jesus, a mobile, flexible, ready-for-anything task force. Now, here's something crucial that most people don't understand about how Jesuits are formed, and it explains why they think and act differently from other religious orders. When a young man decides he wants to become a Jesuit, he's not just signing up for a few years of seminary training. He's committing to what is essentially a 15-year formation process that is designed to transform him completely. It starts with a 2-year novitiate where the focus is entirely on spiritual formation. The novice makes a 30-day retreat following the full spiritual exercises, that month-long intensive experience we just talked about. He spends time working in hospitals, schools, and with poor people to develop practical compassion. He studies the lives of Jesuit saints and martyrs to understand what he might be called to sacrifice. And throughout this period, he's working with a spiritual director who helps him discern whether this is truly his calling. If he completes the novitiate successfully, he takes first vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. But he's nowhere near finished with formation. Next comes several years of intensive intellectual training. Philosophy, theology, languages, sciences, whatever fields he'll need for his future ministry. Jesuits are expected to be intellectually excellent, capable of engaging with the best minds of their time on any subject. But here's what makes it unique. Throughout this entire process, the emphasis isn't just on accumulating knowledge. It's on learning how to think like Jesus, how to see the world through Christ's eyes, how to discern God's will in complex situations. Every Jesuit is trained in spiritual direction, which means learning how to help other people have their own encounters with God. They're taught to pay attention to the movements of the Holy Spirit in their own hearts and in the hearts of others. After ordination to the priesthood, there's usually several more years of practical ministry under supervision, followed by a final year-long retreat called tertianship, where they revisit the spiritual exercises one more time as mature adults and recommit themselves to the Jesuit way of life. Only then, after 15 years or more of formation, do they take their final vows. This intensive formation process explains why Jesuits have always been so adaptable and effective in different cultures and situations. They are not just following a rule book, they've been trained in a method of spiritual discernment that helps them figure out how to serve God in whatever circumstances they find themselves in. When their Jerusalem plan fell through because of political instability in the Middle East, they headed to Rome and presented themselves to Pope Paul III. And this is where their fourth vow comes in, the one that made them different from every other religious order. Most religious orders took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience to their religious superiors. But the Jesuits added a fourth vow, special obedience to the Pope in matters of missions. This might not sound like a big deal, but it was revolutionary. They were saying that they would go anywhere in the world the Pope sent them, take on any assignment he gave them, without question or delay. The Pope had his own personal missionary force, ready to deploy wherever the Church faced its greatest challenges. But they understood that truly following Jesus' Great Commission meant more than just preaching sermons and baptizing converts. Jesus didn't just preach, he healed the sick, fed the hungry, befriended outcasts, challenged injustice, and met people where they were, speaking their language and understanding their culture. So the Jesuits decided they needed to do the same thing. This led them to develop what we might call a holistic approach to evangelization. Instead of just showing up in a new place and immediately starting to preach, they would first learn the local language and customs. They would provide practical services, medical care, education, help with agricultural techniques. They would identify with the local people so completely that they became, in a sense, locals themselves. However, the Jesuits weren't just responding to Jesus' Great Commission in a vacuum. They were responding to it in the middle of the biggest crisis Christianity had faced since the Roman persecutions, the Protestant Reformation. And understanding their role in the Catholic Church's response to that crisis is essential for grasping why they became so influential and controversial. When we think about the Protestant Reformation today, we often focus on theological debates about justification by faith or the authority of Scripture versus tradition. But for the Catholic Church of the 16th century, this wasn't just an intellectual discussion. It was an existential crisis. Entire regions of Europe were abandoning Catholicism. Prestigious universities were embracing Protestant teachings. Political leaders were choosing sides based on religious affiliation. The unity of Western Christianity, which had lasted for over 1,000 years, was shattering. The Catholic Church's initial response to this crisis was largely defensive and reactive. Church leaders called for reforms to address obvious problems like clerical corruption. They established the Roman Inquisition to root out heretical teachings. They put books on the index of prohibited books to prevent the spread of Protestant ideas. But what they really needed was a positive, energetic, intellectually sophisticated response that could win hearts and minds back to Catholicism. And that's exactly what the Jesuits provided. The Jesuits found themselves right in the middle of this clash, and their approach was characteristically innovative. Instead of just condemning Protestant errors or defending Catholic positions through abstract theological arguments, they decided to demonstrate the vitality and attractiveness of Catholic Christianity through their lived witness. They would show, rather than just argue, that Catholic teaching produced saints, that Catholic spirituality could transform lives, that Catholic education could form wise and virtuous leaders. Their role at the Council of Trent, the great Catholic counter-reform council that met periodically between 1545 and 1563, illustrates this perfectly. Pope Paul III specifically requested that Ignatius send two of his best theologians, Diego Laínez and Alfonso Salmerón, to participate in the council as papal theologians. These guys weren't just representing the Jesuit point of view. They were helping the entire Catholic Church articulate its response to Protestant challenges. The instructions that Ignatius gave them before they left for the council show us everything about the Jesuit approach to controversial dialogue. He told them to be mediators rather than protagonists, to listen carefully before speaking, to understand other viewpoints thoroughly before responding, to remain calm and charitable in all their interactions, and to continue their pastoral work with poor and marginalized people, even while participating in high-level theological discussions. Laínez, in particular, became one of the most influential voices at the council, helping to shape Catholic teachings on Scripture and tradition, on justification and good works, and on the sacraments. But he did it not by shouting down opponents or scoring debating points, but by demonstrating the depth and sophistication and pastoral sensitivity of Catholic theology. Meanwhile, other Jesuits were taking this same approach into the mission field and the classroom. In Germany, which was the epicenter of the Protestant Reformation, Jesuit priests like Peter Canisius were revitalizing Catholic parishes, establishing excellent schools, and winning back thousands of people who had left the Catholic Church. Not through coercion or political pressure, but through the obvious sincerity and effectiveness of their ministry. The Jesuit approach to education became one of their most powerful tools in the Counter-Reformation. They understood that if you wanted to influence a culture long-term, you had to form the minds of the next generation. So they established colleges and universities throughout Europe that offered the best education available, not just in theology and philosophy, but in literature, sciences, mathematics, and the arts. The genius of this strategy was that it attracted students from all kinds of families, including Protestant families who recognized the quality of Jesuit education. Many of these students didn't necessarily become Catholic, but they did develop respect and appreciation for Catholic learning and spirituality. Over time, this educational influence helped create a more favorable environment for Catholic renewal in many parts of Europe. But the Jesuits weren't content to just defend Catholic territory in Europe. They were also aggressively expanding Catholic presence into parts of the world that had never heard the gospel before. And this brings us to what might be the most impressive aspect of their entire history: their global missionary enterprise. When Francis Xavier stepped off a Portuguese ship in Goa, India, in 1542, he was beginning what would become one of the most remarkable missionary journeys in Christian history. But to really appreciate what he accomplished, we need to understand the world he was entering. The Portuguese had established trading posts along the Indian coast, but European presence was still minimal and largely confined to commercial enclaves. The vast majority of India's population had never encountered Christianity, and why should they have been interested? They had sophisticated philosophical traditions, rich spiritual practices, established social systems, and thriving economies. But Francis Xavier had something that made him different. He genuinely loved the people he met, and he was willing to become like them in order to reach them. Instead of staying in the comfortable Portuguese settlements, he went into the villages. Instead of preaching in Latin or Portuguese, he learned Tamil and other local languages. Instead of demanding that people abandon all their customs, he tried to distinguish between practices that were incompatible with Christian faith and practices that could be transformed. His methods were incredibly labor-intensive and personally demanding. He would spend hours every day walking from village to village, often in blazing heat, carrying a small bell to gather people for teaching. He translated basic Christian prayers and teachings into local languages, set them to familiar local melodies, and taught them to children who would then teach them to their parents. He offered medical care, helped settle disputes, provided practical assistance with farming and trade. The results were extraordinary. In his 10 years of missionary work in Asia, Francis Xavier is credited with baptizing around 100,000 people. But the stories that spread about his missionary methods were often more extraordinary than the numbers. Witnesses reported that he could speak to people in languages he had never learned, that his wooden crucifix once restored sight to a blind man, and that he raised several people from the dead. When his body was exhumed years after his death, it was found to be completely incorrupted, which many took as a sign of his sanctity. Whether these miraculous accounts were literally true or embellished over time, they became part of the Jesuit mystique. People expected Jesuit missionaries to be not just dedicated teachers, but wonder workers who could demonstrate God's power through supernatural signs. This reputation helped open doors for Jesuit evangelization, but it also created expectations that were impossible for ordinary missionaries to fulfill. But more importantly, he established Christian communities that continued to grow and thrive long after he left. He trained local catechists who could continue the work of teaching and pastoral care. He adapted Christian liturgy and devotions to local cultural forms. His journey from India to Malaysia to Indonesia to Japan illustrates both the global scope of Jesuit ambitions and the incredible personal sacrifice this work required. When Xavier arrived in Japan in 1549, he was entering a society that was arguably more sophisticated and cultured than any European nation of his time. The Japanese had advanced technology, complex literature, subtle philosophical traditions, and highly developed artistic forms. Xavier quickly realized that the missionary methods that had worked in India wouldn't necessarily work in Japan. The Japanese intellectuals he met weren't impressed by simple catechism lessons. They wanted sophisticated theological discussions. They asked probing questions about Christian doctrine that required deep knowledge of both Christian theology and Japanese religious traditions to answer effectively. The breakthrough came when he began presenting Christianity not as a replacement for Japanese culture, but as its fulfillment. He learned to use Buddhist and Confucian terminology to explain Christian concepts. He showed how Christian teachings addressed questions that Japanese philosophers had been asking for centuries. And it worked. Within a few years, there were thousands of Japanese Christians, including members of the samurai class and even some daimyo. The architecture of Japanese Christian churches from this period tells the story beautifully. These buildings looked like Buddhist temples from the outside. Familiar roof lines, garden layouts, decorative elements that any Japanese person would recognize. But inside, they were arranged for Christian worship. It was Christianity in Japanese clothing, and for several decades, it seemed to work brilliantly. Similar stories were playing out across Asia during these same decades. In China, Jesuits like Matteo Ricci were gaining access to the imperial court by demonstrating European advances in mathematics, astronomy, and mechanical engineering. They presented themselves not as foreign religious propagandists, but as scholars and scientists who happened to be Christian. They dressed like Chinese literati, learned classical Chinese literature, and engaged in sophisticated philosophical debates with Confucian intellectuals. Ricci's approach was so effective that he won converts among the highest levels of Chinese society, including members of the imperial family. He decided that honoring Confucius and venerating ancestors were civil rather than religious practices, so Chinese Christians could continue participating in these ceremonies. This decision would later become enormously controversial, but in the short term, it allowed Christianity to take root in Chinese soil. Now, it's important to understand that these missions weren't just spiritual enterprises. They were also economic and political undertakings that required enormous resources and complex organization. The Jesuits became masters of what we might call missionary economics. They established trade networks to fund their activities, developed agricultural and manufacturing operations in their mission territories, and created financial systems that could transfer resources across continents. In Paraguay, for example, the Jesuit reductions weren't just religious communities, they were sophisticated economic enterprises. The Guarani people learned European agricultural techniques and craft production methods. They manufactured goods that were traded throughout South America and even exported to Europe. The profits from these enterprises funded not only the reductions themselves, but also other Jesuit missions around the world. This economic dimension of Jesuit missionary work was both a strength and a source of controversy. On one hand, it allowed them to be financially independent and to provide real material benefits to the people they served. On the other hand, it made them major economic players who sometimes competed with colonial merchants and administrators. And it raised questions about whether their primary motivation was spiritual or material. The role of women in these missionary enterprises is a story that's often overlooked, but it was absolutely crucial. While the Jesuits themselves were celibate men, their missions depended heavily on the collaboration of women, both European and indigenous. In many cultures, women were the primary caregivers for children, the sick, and the elderly. So reaching women was essential for establishing lasting Christian communities. In Japan, for instance, some of the most influential early Christians were women from samurai families who converted and then influenced their husbands and children. In China, Jesuit missionaries worked closely with Chinese women who served as catechists and teachers, especially for other women who couldn't attend mixed gatherings because of cultural restrictions. In the Americas, indigenous women often became bridges between their traditional cultures and the new Christian teachings. They translated not just languages, but entire worldviews, helping their communities understand how Christian beliefs could be integrated with their existing spiritual practices. Many of these women developed remarkable theological insights and spiritual leadership abilities, though their contributions were rarely formally recognized. The Jesuits also repeatedly attempted to establish religious orders for women that would parallel their own work. Ignatius himself worked closely with several women who wanted to dedicate their lives to serving God in radical ways. But the church hierarchy of the time was deeply suspicious of women's religious autonomy, and most of these attempts were blocked or severely restricted. This tension around women's roles would continue throughout Jesuit history and remains a complex issue today. The Jesuits have generally been more supportive of women's equality and leadership than many other parts of the Catholic Church, but they've also been limited by broader church policies that restrict women's ordination and official leadership roles. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the Jesuit global expansion was their creation of the first truly international education system. By the early 17th century, there were Jesuit schools on every continent, all following the same basic pedagogical principles, but adapted to local conditions and needs. Let me paint a picture for you of what it was like to attend a Jesuit college in the 16th or 17th century, because understanding their educational philosophy helps us see how they were trying to live out Jesus' teaching mission in a systematic way. Imagine you're a young man from a middle-class family in Prague or Lima or Manila. Your parents have heard that the Jesuits run excellent schools that don't charge tuition, so they send you to the local Jesuit college. From the moment you walk through the doors, it's clear that this isn't just about memorizing information or learning job skills. The Jesuits have thought deeply about how human beings learn and grow. And they've designed every aspect of your education to form not just your mind, but your character. The curriculum is demanding, but carefully sequenced. You start with grammar and rhetoric, learning to read, write, and speak with precision and elegance. But here's what made Jesuit education distinctive. They understood that learning happens through active engagement, not passive absorption. So instead of just listening to lectures, you're constantly participating in debates, writing compositions, performing in plays, competing in academic contests. The classroom is alive with intellectual energy. The theatrical productions that became famous features of Jesuit schools weren't just entertainment. They were ways of helping students embody moral and spiritual truths, literally putting themselves into the shoes of saints and heroes and villains to understand from the inside what different choices lead to. When you spend weeks preparing to portray Saint Sebastian or King David or Pontius Pilate, you're exploring their motivations, their struggles, their triumphs and failures in ways that shape your own moral imagination. This integration of academic learning with artistic expression and spiritual formation produced graduates who were unusually well-rounded and capable. They could write elegantly, speak persuasively, think clearly, and act courageously. They had been exposed to the best of human culture while being formed in Christian virtue, and the social impact of this education was enormous. Jesuit schools produced government officials, military leaders, merchants, artists, writers, scientists, and clergy who carried Jesuit values and methods into every sector of society. In many parts of Europe and the Americas, being educated by Jesuits became a mark of intellectual distinction and moral formation, but the Jesuits didn't limit themselves to classical liberal arts education. They were also pioneers in scientific research and technological innovation. This might surprise some people who think of religion and science as natural enemies, but the Jesuits saw scientific investigation as a form of worship, a way of exploring God's creation and understanding how the natural world reflected divine wisdom. Jesuit astronomers made crucial contributions to our understanding of the solar system. They built some of the finest observatories in Europe and Asia, made detailed observations of planetary movements, and developed new techniques for mathematical calculation. Christopher Clavius helped design the Gregorian calendar that we still use today. Giovanni Battista Riccioli created lunar maps that were used for centuries. Jesuit mathematicians developed new techniques in algebra and geometry that advanced human knowledge significantly. They were among the first Europeans to seriously study Chinese and Indian mathematical traditions, and they served as bridges between different mathematical cultures. Their textbooks were used in universities throughout Europe. The scope of Jesuit scientific achievements was staggering when you look at the specifics. They literally invented the science of seismology, the study of earthquakes. Jesuit observatories in Europe and Asia developed the first systematic methods for recording and analyzing seismic activity. When major earthquakes struck, governments consulted Jesuit scientists for explanations and predictions. In astronomy, so many lunar craters and celestial features were discovered by Jesuit astronomers that the moon's surface reads like a directory of the Society of Jesus. Craters named after Jesuits include Clavius, Riccioli, Grimaldi, and dozens of others. Jesuit observatories in Rome, Beijing, and other cities were among the most advanced in the world, and their astronomical calculations were used for navigation, calendar reform, and agricultural planning. Their linguistic work was equally impressive in scale. Jesuit missionaries created the first dictionaries, grammars, and written literature for over 100 indigenous languages around the world. They preserved languages that would otherwise have been lost forever and created communication bridges between cultures that had never been in contact before. Some Jesuit linguists became fluent in a dozen or more languages and could serve as translators between completely different cultural groups. Perhaps most importantly, Jesuit linguists created the first dictionaries and grammars for dozens of indigenous languages around the world. They preserved languages that might otherwise have been lost, developed writing systems for oral cultures, and created tools that allowed different peoples to communicate with each other. These linguistic achievements were absolutely crucial for both missionary work and cultural preservation. Jesuit botanists and physicians cataloged new plants and medical treatments discovered in their missionary work. They brought cinchona bark from South America to Europe, providing the first effective treatment for malaria. They documented indigenous medical practices and often found that traditional remedies were more effective than European treatments. This combination of scientific curiosity with religious faith wasn't accidental. It flowed directly from their theological conviction that God reveals himself both through Scripture and through the natural world. If you wanted to know God better, you needed to study his creation carefully and systematically. There was no conflict between faith and reason, because both were ways of encountering the same divine truth. But this scientific work also got them into trouble when their discoveries seemed to conflict with traditional religious teachings. The Galileo affair is the most famous example, though it's often misunderstood. Several prominent Jesuit astronomers actually supported Galileo's heliocentric theory, but they found themselves caught between scientific evidence and church authority. The tension between pursuing truth wherever it led and maintaining loyalty to church teaching would be a recurring challenge throughout Jesuit history. And this brings us to the controversies that were building up around the Jesuits as they became more prominent and influential. Their success was generating resentment and suspicion from multiple quarters, and some of these criticisms had legitimate foundations while others were based on misconceptions and conspiracy theories. Now, here's where our story takes a darker turn, and we need to confront some uncomfortable truths about what happens when religious movements become powerful and influential. Because the Jesuits weren't just successful missionaries and educators, they had also become major players in the political and economic systems of their time. And that combination of spiritual authority with temporal power has always been dangerous territory for Christian organizations. By the 18th century, the Jesuits controlled vast educational networks. How did they fund this massive global operation? The Jesuits became masters of what we might call religious capitalism. They established trade networks that connected Europe, Asia, and the Americas, dealing in everything from Chinese silk and tea to South American silver and Paraguayan yerba mate. Their missions weren't just spiritual outposts. They were economic enterprises that generated the revenue needed to support missionary work. In China, Jesuit astronomers were paid by the imperial government for their calendar calculations and scientific advice. In South America, the reductions produced manufactured goods that competed successfully with European imports. In Europe, Jesuit colleges often owned large estates that generated rental income and agricultural profits. They even pioneered some early forms of banking, transferring money across continents through their international network of houses and missions. This economic success was both a strength and a vulnerability. It allowed them to be financially independent and to provide real material benefits to the people they served. But it also made them targets for colonial merchants who resented the competition, government officials who wanted to tax their profits, and other religious orders who envied their resources. Extensive missionary territories, and significant economic resources. In Paraguay alone, their reductions encompassed territory larger than many European countries. Their schools educated the sons of nobles and wealthy merchants throughout Catholic Europe. Their missionaries had influence in royal courts from Lisbon to Beijing, and their superior general in Rome, sometimes called the Black Pope because of his black robes and extensive authority, was arguably one of the most powerful men in Catholic Christendom. Now, let's talk about this Black Pope business, because it's one of those conspiracy theories that has some basis in reality but gets wildly exaggerated. The Jesuit superior general was indeed called the Black Pope by some people, but not because he was running some shadowy parallel papacy. The nickname came from the fact that he wore black robes instead of the white robes of the actual pope, and because he did have unusual authority within the Catholic Church. Unlike other religious orders, whose members were primarily accountable to local bishops, Jesuits answered directly to their superior general, who in turn answered only to the pope. This meant that the superior general could deploy thousands of highly educated, highly motivated men anywhere in the world without having to negotiate with local church authorities. In an age when communication was slow and transportation was difficult, this kind of centralized authority was genuinely powerful. But the conspiracy theories that grew up around this authority were often wildly exaggerated. Yes, Jesuits were involved in politics. They served as confessors to kings, advisors to princes, and negotiators in international disputes. But they weren't puppet masters controlling world events from behind the scenes. They were more like a highly effective consulting firm that specialized in education, diplomacy, and cross-cultural communication. What most people don't realize is that Jesuits also survived the suppression in other creative ways that bordered on the miraculous. In China, former Jesuits continued their missionary work by becoming members of other religious orders or by working as lay teachers and translators. Some maintained secret networks that preserved Jesuit spirituality and methods even when they couldn't use the Jesuit name. In Europe, former Jesuits created informal societies and educational institutions that carried on Jesuit work under different names. They developed code words and secret signals that allowed them to recognize each other and coordinate their activities. Alumni of Jesuit schools often became patrons who protected former Jesuit priests and funded their continued work. Perhaps most remarkably, many Jesuit saints and mystics reported supernatural protection during this period. Stories circulated about former Jesuits who were warned of danger through visions, who found shelter in impossible circumstances, or who were able to continue their ministry despite official persecution. Whether these accounts were literally true or not, they sustained hope and morale during the darkest period in Jesuit history. But the conspiracy theories went much deeper and darker than questions about administrative authority. Throughout their history, Jesuits have been accused of involvement in political assassinations, palace coups, and secret conspiracies. They were blamed for the gunpowder plot in England, accused of poisoning kings in France, and suspected of orchestrating revolutions in various countries. Most of these accusations were completely unfounded, but they stuck because Jesuits did serve as confessors and advisors to powerful people. And when those people made unpopular decisions, it was easy to blame the Jesuit puppet masters. The assassination allegations were particularly persistent. When King Henry IV of France was assassinated in 1610, some blamed Jesuit teachings about tyrannicide, the idea that it might be morally acceptable to kill an unjust ruler under extreme circumstances. When President Lincoln was assassinated, conspiracy theorists noted that John Wilkes Booth had attended a Jesuit school. These connections were usually coincidental, but they fed a narrative that Jesuits were dangerous political operators willing to use any means necessary to advance their goals. The reality was more mundane, but also more complicated. Jesuits were deeply involved in the political world of their time because that's where influential people lived and worked. If you wanted to spread Christian values and promote justice, you had to engage with the people who made decisions that affected millions of lives. But this engagement inevitably made them seem like political players rather than purely spiritual figures, and it opened them up to suspicion and blame when political situations went wrong. The reputation for being manipulative reasoners came from their approach to moral theology, which emphasized careful analysis of complex situations rather than rigid application of simple rules. This approach, called casuistry, was designed to help people make good moral decisions in difficult circumstances, but critics accused them of finding loopholes in moral law, of being too willing to excuse human weakness, of making ethics so complicated that anything could be justified. This criticism wasn't entirely unfair. Some Jesuit moral theologians did develop very elaborate systems for analyzing moral questions, and some of their conclusions seemed to ordinary people like sophisticated ways of avoiding clear moral obligations. The stereotype of Jesuits as clever equivocators who could argue any position had some basis in the actual complexity of their moral theology. But the most serious controversies arose from their missionary methods and their relationship with political authorities. The Chinese rights controversy, which we touched on earlier, became a major crisis that damaged Jesuit credibility throughout the Catholic world. What had started as a disagreement about missionary methods escalated into a bitter theological and political battle that lasted for decades. The core issue was whether Chinese Christians could continue participating in traditional ceremonies honoring Confucius and ancestors. The Jesuits argued that these were civil rather than religious practices, like saluting a flag or standing for a national anthem. Franciscan and Dominican missionaries argued that these ceremonies were fundamentally religious and therefore incompatible with Christian faith. This wasn't just an abstract theological debate. It had enormous practical implications. If Chinese Christians had to abandon all traditional ceremonies, they would be cut off from their families and communities. They would be unable to participate in civil society or government service. Christianity would become a foreign religion that required people to abandon their cultural identity entirely. The Jesuits believed that their approach was not only pastorally wise, but theologically sound. After all, hadn't St. Paul taught that Christians could eat meat sacrificed to idols as long as they didn't personally believe the idols were real? Hadn't the early church found ways to integrate pagan festivals and customs into Christian celebrations? Why should Chinese Christians be held to a stricter standard than other converts throughout history? But their critics saw this as a dangerous compromise. They argued that the Jesuits were so eager to win converts that they were willing to water down essential Christian truths. They accused the Jesuits of creating a syncretic religion that mixed Christian teachings with pagan practices. They claimed that Chinese Christians weren't really Christians at all, just confused pagans who had been deceived by Jesuit accommodation. Pope after pope was drawn into this dispute, with rulings that zigzagged back and forth between supporting and condemning Jesuit practices. Finally, in the early 18th century, Pope Clement V issued a definitive decree condemning the Chinese rites as incompatible with Christian faith and ordering all Catholic converts in China to abandon these practices entirely. This decision was a disaster for Christianity in China. The Chinese emperor, understandably offended by the implication that traditional Chinese ceremonies were demonic or superstitious, banned Christian missions entirely. Thousands of Chinese Christians were forced to choose between their ancestral customs and their new faith. Many chose to abandon Christianity rather than dishonor their ancestors. The thriving Catholic Church that Jesuit missionaries had built over centuries was reduced to an underground remnant. Around the same time, the Jesuits found themselves embroiled in an even more bitter conflict with a movement called Jansenism. Jansenists accused the Jesuits of being too lenient in their approach to sin and forgiveness, too willing to accommodate human weakness, too optimistic about human nature's capacity for good. This theological dispute became incredibly nasty, with both sides publishing vicious attacks on their opponents. Jansenists portrayed Jesuits as corrupt compromisers who had sold out the gospel for worldly success. Jesuits portrayed Jansenists as proud Pharisees who had forgotten the good news of God's grace. The dispute divided Catholic intellectual life and created lasting suspicion of Jesuit theology. But the most serious threat to Jesuit survival came from their missionary work in South America, particularly the Paraguayan reductions. These Christian communities had been spectacularly successful at protecting indigenous peoples and promoting their social and economic development. But that very success made them targets for colonial authorities who wanted unrestricted access to indigenous labor and land. The crisis came in 1750 when Spain and Portugal signed a treaty that redrew colonial boundaries in South America. 7 of the Paraguayan reductions were transferred from Spanish to Portuguese control, and the Portuguese demanded that these communities relocate, abandoning their homes, farms, workshops, and churches. The Guarani people refused to leave. These settlements had been their homes for generations. They had built schools, hospitals, and beautiful Baroque churches. They had developed sophisticated agricultural and craft industries. They had created a unique synthesis of Christian faith and indigenous culture. Why should they abandon all of this because European colonial powers had redrawn some lines on a map? The Jesuits found themselves caught in an impossible situation. Their primary loyalty was to the Guarani people they served, who clearly didn't want to relocate. But they were also bound by vows of obedience to church authorities, who were under pressure from Spanish and Portuguese governments to enforce the treaty. When the Jesuits reluctantly supported Guarani resistance to forced relocation, colonial authorities accused them of treason and rebellion. The resulting conflict, known as the War of the Seven Reductions, lasted for several years and ended in defeat for the Guarani communities and their Jesuit advisors. Thousands of indigenous people were killed or displaced. The reduction system was severely damaged, and the Jesuits were blamed for the entire debacle. This accusation of disloyalty became a major weapon in the hands of Jesuit enemies throughout Europe. The Marquis of Pombal in Portugal, Choiseul in France, and Aranda in Spain all used the Paraguayan conflict as evidence that Jesuits were a dangerous, seditious organization that put papal authority above national sovereignty. One by one, these powerful ministers convinced their monarchs to expel the Jesuits from their territories. Portugal expelled the Jesuits in 1759. France suppressed them in 1764. Spain and the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies followed in 1767. In each case, Jesuit property was confiscated, Jesuit priests were arrested or exiled, and Jesuit schools and missions were closed or transferred to other religious orders. The expulsions were traumatic for thousands of individual Jesuits who found themselves homeless and stateless, but they were also devastating for the communities the Jesuits had served. In many places, there simply weren't enough qualified teachers or missionaries to replace them. Educational standards declined, missions were abandoned, and centuries of careful cross-cultural work was lost overnight. But before we talk about the final suppression that was coming, we need to honestly grapple with the colonial question that underlies much of this controversy. Because when we look back at Jesuit missions through modern eyes, we have to ask some difficult questions about cultural imperialism, even when it came with genuinely good intentions. From a modern perspective, we can see both the admirable aspects and the problematic aspects of this approach. The Jesuits were far ahead of their time in recognizing the value of other cultures and in trying to minimize cultural disruption. They often found themselves in conflict with colonial authorities precisely because they were defending indigenous rights and opposing exploitative practices. Many Jesuit missionaries suffered and died trying to protect the people they served, but they were still working within a framework that saw Christianity and European civilization as essentially linked, and they couldn't imagine that indigenous peoples might have spiritual insights and cultural achievements that Europeans could learn from. They saw their role as bringing enlightenment to peoples living in darkness, rather than as entering into mutual relationships where both sides could be enriched. This colonial legacy continues to affect how indigenous communities and post-colonial societies relate to Christianity today. Some see the Jesuits as relatively benevolent colonizers who at least tried to protect indigenous peoples and respect their cultures. Others see them as sophisticated agents of cultural imperialism who were more dangerous than cruder colonizers precisely because they were more effective at winning hearts and minds. Contemporary Jesuits have wrestled seriously with this history and have generally acknowledged both the positive and negative aspects of their colonial-era missions. They've worked to develop more genuinely mutual relationships with indigenous communities, to support indigenous leadership within the church, and to learn from indigenous spiritual traditions rather than simply trying to replace them. But this colonial question was part of what made the Jesuits so controversial in the 18th century, and it contributed to the final blow that was about to fall. Because as European Enlightenment thinking began to challenge the entire basis of traditional authority, religious, political, and cultural, the Jesuits found themselves representing everything that Enlightenment thinkers opposed. The final blow came in 1773 when Pope Clement XIV, under enormous pressure from Catholic monarchs, issued the brief Dominus ac Redemptor, officially suppressing the Society of Jesus throughout the Catholic world. This wasn't just a temporary suspension or a limited restriction. It was a complete abolition of an order that had existed for over 2 centuries. The reasons the Pope gave for this drastic action were telling. He didn't accuse the Jesuits of heresy or moral corruption. Instead, he said that the order had become so controversial that its continued existence threatened the peace of the Church and the harmony between the Church and Catholic governments. In other words, the Jesuits were being suppressed not because they had done anything wrong, but because they had made too many powerful enemies. This decision was heartbreaking for many Catholics who had been educated by Jesuits, served by Jesuit priests, or inspired by Jesuit spirituality. It was also practically disastrous for Catholic missions and education around the world. But the suppression wasn't quite as complete as it appeared, because some remarkable things happened during the 41 years when the Society of Jesus officially didn't exist. First, many former Jesuits continued working as diocesan priests, carrying Jesuit spirituality and methods into their new roles. They continued giving the spiritual exercises, running schools according to Jesuit educational principles, and maintaining relationships with former Jesuit colleagues around the world. The charism lived on even when the institution was officially dead. Second, and most remarkably, the Society of Jesus actually continued to exist legally in one unexpected place, Catherine the Great's Russia. The Orthodox Empress refused to promulgate the papal brief in her territories because she valued the educational work the Jesuits were doing in her empire. So, while Jesuits everywhere else had to abandon their religious vows and find new ways to serve the Church, the Jesuits in Russia continued functioning as a religious order. This Russian remnant of the Society of Jesus became a lifeline that preserved Jesuit traditions and identity during the suppression period. They maintained the Jesuit way of life, continued training new members, and kept alive the institutional memory that would be crucial when the order was eventually restored. The restoration came in 1814 when Pope Pius VII, having seen how much the Church had lost by suppressing the Jesuits, officially reconstituted the Society of Jesus. But the order that emerged from this resurrection was different from the one that had been suppressed. They had learned hard lessons about the dangers of worldly success and political entanglement. The 19th century Jesuits were initially much more cautious and conservative than their predecessors had been. Having seen how their flexibility and innovation had gotten them into trouble, they tended to be more rigid in their adherence to church teaching and more suspicious of cultural adaptation. They focused on traditional religious activities, parishes, schools, retreats, and avoided the kind of high-profile political involvement that had contributed to their suppression. This conservative phase was reinforced by the broader political and religious climate of 19th century Europe, where the Catholic Church felt under siege from liberal political movements, scientific materialism, and Protestant expansion. The Jesuits became strong supporters of papal authority and defenders of traditional Catholic positions against what they saw as the errors of modern thinking. During this period, they played a crucial role in the development of Ultramontanism, the movement that emphasized the Pope's supreme authority over national churches and local bishops. When the First Vatican Council met in 1869-1870 to define the doctrine of papal infallibility, Jesuit theologians were among its strongest supporters. They saw papal authority as the best defense against the relativism and nationalism that were fragmenting Christian unity. The Jesuits also found themselves involved in the modernist crisis of the early 20th century, when Pope Pius VI condemned what he saw as attempts to accommodate Catholic teaching to modern biblical scholarship, evolutionary theory, and historical critical methods. Many Jesuit scholars were suspected of modernist tendencies because of their involvement in scientific and historical research, and the order had to work carefully to maintain its reputation for orthodoxy while continuing its intellectual work. This tension between intellectual honesty and religious loyalty would be a recurring theme throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. The Jesuits wanted to engage seriously with modern knowledge and culture, but they also wanted to remain clearly within the bounds of Catholic orthodoxy. Sometimes these goals conflicted, and individual Jesuits had to make difficult choices about how to balance academic freedom with religious obedience. But by the early 20th century, a new generation of Jesuit leadership was beginning to push the order back toward the kind of innovative, adaptive approach that had characterized their early history. They were rediscovering the writings of Ignatius and the early Jesuits, and they were beginning to ask whether their 19th century caution had caused them to lose something essential about their original charism. This recovery of their founding spirit was accelerated by the traumatic experiences of 2 world wars, which forced Catholics to confront the limitations of European civilization and the need for genuinely global approaches to human problems. Jesuit intellectuals like Pierre Teilhard de Chardin began developing new ways of thinking about evolution, science, and spirituality that would influence Catholic thinking for decades. But the real transformation came during and after the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s, when the Catholic Church officially embraced many of the approaches to modernity, religious freedom, and cultural adaptation that the Jesuits had been pioneering for centuries. Suddenly, their emphasis on enculturation, intellectual engagement, and social justice wasn't controversial. It was official church policy. Under the leadership of Pedro Arrupe, who served as Superior General from 1965 to 1983, the Jesuits explicitly committed themselves to the service of faith and the promotion of justice as inseparable aspects of their mission. This wasn't just about individual charity or personal holiness. It was about working to transform social, economic, and political structures that perpetuate poverty, oppression, and marginalization. The Jesuits played crucial roles in drafting several key Vatican II documents, particularly those dealing with religious freedom, the relationship between the Church and the modern world, and the Church's mission to promote human dignity and social justice. Their experience in cross-cultural ministry and their intellectual engagement with modern thought made them natural leaders in the Council as effort to renew Catholic life and thought. In the decades following Vatican II, Jesuits became leaders in developing liberation theology in Latin America, which emphasized God's preferential option for the poor and the Church's responsibility to work for social transformation. They were at the forefront of interfaith dialogue, environmental activism, work with refugees and immigrants, and efforts to address economic inequality. This renewed commitment to social justice brought the Jesuits back into conflict with both secular authorities and some church leaders who preferred a more traditional, less politically engaged approach to ministry. In El Salvador, 6 Jesuit priests were murdered in 1989 by government forces because of their advocacy for peace and human rights. In other parts of the world, Jesuits found themselves in tension with Vatican officials who worried that their social activism was overshadowing their spiritual mission. But supporters argued that this was exactly what Jesuit charism had always been about, taking the implications of Christian faith seriously enough to let them reshape not just individual lives, but entire societies. They pointed to Jesus' own ministry, which combined spiritual teaching with concern for the poor, the sick, the marginalized, and the oppressed. This tension came to a head in 2013 when Jorge Mario Bergoglio, a Jesuit from Argentina, was elected Pope Francis, the first Jesuit to become Bishop of Rome in the order's 473-year history. His election shocked many observers who assumed that Jesuit controversies made them unsuitable for the papacy. Pope Francis has embodied many of the best aspects of Jesuit spirituality and mission: deep personal prayer, intellectual curiosity, pastoral sensitivity, concern for the marginalized, and willingness to challenge entrenched attitudes and practices. His approach to controversial issues, his welcoming attitude toward divorced Catholics, his emphasis on mercy over judgment, his strong advocacy for environmental protection and economic justice all reflect distinctively Jesuit emphases on discernment, adaptation, and service. But his papacy has also generated the same kinds of criticism that Jesuits have always faced: accusations of being too flexible on moral issues, too willing to accommodate cultural differences, too focused on social problems at the expense of doctrinal clarity, and too independent of traditional ecclesiastical constraints. And this brings us full circle to the fundamental question we started with. What happens when people take Jesus' teachings to their absolute extreme? The Jesuit story over 5 centuries suggests that the answer is both inspiring and complicated. On one hand, this kind of radical commitment produces extraordinary fruit. Countless people evangelized, educated, healed, and served. Major contributions to human knowledge and culture, courageous stands for justice and human dignity, and a spirituality that has helped millions of people deepen their relationship with God. On the other hand, this same radical commitment generates conflict, controversy, and sometimes destructive consequences. When you try to incarnate Christian love in concrete historical situations, you inevitably make judgments that some people will disagree with. When you try to serve both God and neighbor with complete dedication, you sometimes find that these loyalties pull you in different directions. The Jesuit experience suggests that there might not be any way to avoid these tensions completely. Following Jesus seriously means accepting that you'll sometimes be misunderstood, sometimes make mistakes, and sometimes find yourself in conflict with people and institutions you respect. It means accepting that faithful discipleship in a complex world requires constant discernment, frequent course corrections, and the humility to admit when you've gotten things wrong. But it also means trusting that God can work through imperfect human efforts to accomplish purposes that go far beyond what any individual or organization intends. The young Spanish nobleman who got his leg shattered by a cannonball couldn't have imagined that his personal conversion would eventually lead to a global network of schools and missions, a distinctive approach to Christian spirituality, and a tradition of prophetic witness that continues to challenge and inspire people today. The Society of Jesus continues today with about 16,000 members working in over 100 countries. They run universities that educate world leaders, retreat centers that offer the spiritual exercises to thousands of people annually, parishes in some of the world's poorest communities, research institutes that grapple with complex social and ethical questions, and refugee services that assist displaced people around the globe. They're still asking Ignatius' fundamental question: how can we help people encounter Jesus Christ in ways that transform both their personal lives and the world around them? They're still making the same kinds of mistakes and achieving the same kinds of unexpected breakthroughs that have marked their history from the beginning. They're still reminding the rest of us that following Jesus seriously is neither comfortable nor predictable, but it's never boring, and it's always worth it. As we wrap up this incredible journey through 5 centuries of Jesuit history, the most important question isn't whether they got everything right. They clearly didn't. The most important question is whether their example challenges us to think more seriously about what it means to follow Jesus in our own context. Are we willing to let our encounter with Christ reshape not just our private spiritual lives, but our entire approach to being human in the world? Are we willing to risk misunderstanding and criticism in order to serve people that others might overlook or dismiss? The Jesuits would be the first to tell you that they do not have all the answers to these questions. But their story suggests that wrestling with these questions seriously and letting that wrestling shape how you live might be exactly what Jesus meant when he called his followers to take up their cross and follow him. Not as a burden to be endured, but as an adventure to be embraced, a mission to be accomplished, and a way of finding life by losing it in service to something greater than yourself. And maybe that's the real legacy of that cannonball that shattered Inigo's leg on the walls of Pamplona. Not just the creation of another religious order, but a reminder that God specializes in turning our deepest wounds into our greatest gifts, our most painful failures into our most fruitful service, and our most reluctant surrenders into our most joyful discoveries of what we were actually created to do. The company of Jesus, Jesus' own company, marches on.